All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network's Learn Web Development series. We're talking tools and testing and cross-browser testing, and in particular, accessibility. You may or may not remember, but a while back, we started working on this I Love Mo site. Now, it looks terrible. I understand that. But what I want to do is I want to come into the source for this. So it's right there. And I want to just, I don't even know, do we have an about page? Yes, we do. All right, do we have a contact page? Yes, we do. And they don't have much on them. All right. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this CSS file that we have in here and temporarily change the name of it from styles to style. All right. Then I'm going to go back to my site. So essentially now I've got no CSS on here. Now if I refresh, you can already see how it changed. All right. And I can go to the other pages. And again, you can see that once I do that, it's not that there's anything wrong with this, but this is a site that's virtually almost pure CSS. All right. And not setting it up, and I didn't set up a lot of it with tags, etc. You're going to have a problem for people who use assistive technology. All right. Certain HTML features can be selected using only the keyboard. That's their default behavior since the early days of the web. All right, it says you can try this out using our native keyboard accessibility HTML. Okay. Now, can we do this? Can we tab to it? And hit enter. Yes, it works. Tab again. Enter. Yes, it works. Tab again. Yes, it works. Okay. It says you should see the tab focus start to move to the different focusable elements. It says you can then press enter and return to follow a focus length. That's what I just showed you. It says different browsers may have different keyboard control options available. Firefox for the Mac doesn't do any tapping by default. Safari doesn't allow you to tap through links by default. All right. So it can be easy, it can be intuitive, it can be almost automatic for some people to work through this stuff, and much harder, if not impossible, for others. And as the author mentions here, you should perform this kind of test and review on any page you write. If at all possible, when you're getting in, if you decide you're going to get in a user group, which I believe we talk about shortly, you might want to get in your user group, you might want to see if you can get people who use assistive technologies in there to test out your site. Says the example highlights the importance of using the correct semantic element, I should say, for the correct job. It is possible to style any element to look like a link or button using CSS, but that doesn't mean that it's going to work the way that you think it would for people with assistive technologies. I've been as guilty of this probably as anyone. For example, I've done things like where I've used Bootstrap, and using Bootstrap, I've gone in and taken a hyperlink. You can do that in Bootstrap and make it a button. Now, I believe it's got some stuff built in for ARIA in there, but I'm not positive. If you decide to remove the default focus using CSS, make sure to replace it with something else that you think fits the design better. It is a very valuable accessibility tool and should not be removed. Sometimes it's not possible to avoid losing keyboard accessibility. As it says, you may have inherited a site that the semantics are not very good, and you may or may not be able to go in and work on it, fix it, etc. It may be possible that you've got a site that's deficient in areas, but for whatever reason, you're not allowed to take that site down. So it says you've got a few options here. Create custom controls using button elements. and JavaScript to wire up the functionality, I should say. Create keyboard shortcuts using JavaScript. Use some interesting tactics to fake button behavior. All right, there's an example, fake buttons. And if we take a look at the code, looks like these are just divs that are in here. They're not actual buttons, but we've wired them up using JavaScript so that they do act like buttons. Text alternatives are very important for accessibility. We've talked about this before. If a person has a visual or hearing impairment that stops them from being able to see or hear content, it's a problem. It says the simplest text alternative would be the Alt tab, for example, for images. All right. As it says, this should contain a description of the image that successfully conveys its meaning. There's other things that you can add in there too. There's a title tag, and there's other stuff that you can do. Alt text is slightly more complex for video and audio content. There is a way to track tracks and display them when video is being played in the form of a track element. Browser compatibility for features like this is fairly good. As time's going on, you're finding more and more people who need assistive technology for whatever reason. There are certain features and best practices in HTML designed to provide content and relationship between elements where none other exists. Common examples are links, form labels, and data tables. Excuse me. The key to accessible link text is that people using screen readers will often use a common feature whereby they pull up a list of all links for the page. Again, you shouldn't be using things like click me and click here. All right, the context in which you set up the link text should make sense, especially to an assistive device. Labels, we've talked about using labels and the for attribute, etc. And to link them unambiguously as they put it in here with typically their input tag. Data tables, as it says, tables, we've talked about this before, should be used for tabular data and nothing else. All right. It says a basic data table can be written with very simple markup, but has problems. All right. So they're showing you the source here. And you'll notice there's the table, and it's got TRs and it's got TDs, so there's no table headers. There's no T-head section. There's no T-foot section. There's no T-body section. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work. So if I grab this and I bring it up in an editor, get rid of that. I don't need this anymore. That was a waste. And I'm going to save this as table1.html. All right. And then I'm going to open it up. So there's table 1. Okay. Now it isn't formatted at all, but it makes sense. All right. You can look at it if you're not using an assistive technology device, and it probably makes pretty much sense. All right. Then they want you to contrast that with this complete one. So let's look at the difference. And you notice right away when you look at it, what do you have? You've got a caption, you've got a T head, you've got THs, which you have scope in there. All right, you've got, a lot of THs in here for each thing that you're working with. All right, so if we bring that in, again, this was 32 lines long, and it did resonate. This is more than double that size. We'll call this table 2.html. All right, and we'll bring that one up. It doesn't look that much different. What is different? Well, notice, since we put in all of our headers are bolded, All right. We've got a caption in here. It's just more intuitive, again, to an assistive device. CSS tends to provide a lot fewer fundamental accessibility problems than HTML, but there are still things that can happen. It says we have already mentioned a couple of accessibility tips involving CSS. Use the correct semantic elements. If you want a different effect, use CSS. Don't abuse HTML. For example, it says if you want bigger text, use font size, not an H1 element. You should have only one H1 element on a page. You can take and use CSS and format and make H1 and H2 or H1 and H3 elements the same font size if you want to do that. But remember, there is some contextual meaning regarding H1 versus H2 versus H3, etc. Next, make sure the source order makes sense without CSS. Finally, make sure your interactive elements like buttons and links have appropriate focus, hover, active states. All right, there are a few other things it says you might want to take into account. When choosing a color scheme, make sure that the text contrasts well with the background. We've talked about this before. If the background and the text color are too close, it's going to be very hard for people who are colorblind to iterate their way through your site. Another tip is not to rely on color alone for signposts and information. This will do no good for those who can't see the color. Instead of marking required form fields in red, mark them with an asterisk, or do both. Hiding content. There are many instances where visual design will require that not all content is shown at once. For example, it says there, in our tab box example, we have 3 panels of information, but we are positioning them on top of one another and providing tabs that can be clicked for each one. And you notice how this changes accordingly. Oops. It is also keyboard accessible. You can alternatively use tab and enter to select them. Screen readers don't care about any of this. They're happy as long as the source order makes sense and they can get to it all. Now, it kind of leads to something else that's not even in here. But when you use things like Flexbox, for example, you can change the order of something on screen without having to change it in the actual document itself. Never even thought about it that way until right now, but I suppose that could potentially have ramifications as well. Another article that they note in here, invisible content, just for screen readers, has a lot of useful details surrounding this. Okay, JavaScript has the same kind of problems as CSS with respect to accessibility. It can be disastrous if used badly or overused. It says we've already hinted at some problems, mainly in the area of semantic HTML. All right. Given simple functionality should work with just HTML in place, JavaScript should only be used to enhance functionality, not to build it. We've talked about this before. Good uses. Yeah, we go through this in class. We build a form and then we go back and we validate it. We look at it at least in 3 ways, maybe even 4 ways. One way is we validate it. In fact, we just create the form and we put in no validation whatsoever. Kind of what I call the ostrich method, where the ostrich basically hides its head and hopes that the world runs by beside it. Well, that's the worst. There is built-in HTML form checking validation that you can use, but it's limited. Then we go in with JavaScript and we add more. Then we even look at some kind of a JavaScript library. All right. Okay. Providing custom controls for HTML videos that are accessible to keyboard-only users. We've talked about that before. Most complex JavaScript implementations can create issues with accessibility. You need to do what you can. All right, let's see if we can finish this up. I'm already at 15 minutes, so I guess, let's see. There's a bit more to do in here. So I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop it right here and we'll make a third part where we'll probably finish this up.